back to our pause menu, we're going to code the pause. So first, I want us to set the default state of our menu. We don't want the overlay to show in-game by default, so we're going to toggle the visibility off. Then select the user interface node and let's create our user interface script. There, we are going to manage the pause state of the game and a little more. We'll see that afterwards, like put some label when the player died, etc. Anyway, we are going to create a variable called paused to manage the paused state of the game and of the interface as well. And we're going to use the setter function, the setter feature of Godot, to go through a function whenever we pause the game. So let's create that function. The reason for that is that when you pause the game, you not only want to change the pause state of the scene tree, but you want to toggle this menu on and off. So we're going to create a setPaused function. Again, it always takes a value, a Boolean in that case, so true or false, and it does not return anything. Now, first thing to do with a setter is to assign the value to the variable that you want to set, to change. Then we are going to set the scene tree to be the same state as our paused value here. And to do so, we are going to cache the scene tree. We are going to get the scene tree node and store it in a variable. And we can do that using an onReady variable. So the onReady keyword, remember, triggers right before the _ready function in Godot and allows you to get nodes and to store that in memory. Because getting nodes all the time, if you have a very large game, can start to use quite a bit of CPU, to use quite a bit of performances, so it can be nice to do it ahead of time. So scene tree, we're going to call the get tree function here at the start, and that way within this script we can use the scene tree variable to refer to the scene tree node. So in our setPaused function, we're going to write scene tree.paused, and you'll see you get full autocompletion thanks to the type hints here. We're going to set it to our value here. But that's not all. We're also going to change the visibility of the pause overlay. And so this is a convention we use at GDQuest where we cache what we call the dependencies, the other nodes in the scene or outside the scene that we use inside a given script. So I'm going to create a new onReady variable for my pause overlay, and we're going to get the node called pause overlay here, right? And for the type, it won't give you an error if you use the automatic type like that, but you can say that this is actually a color rectangle here to Godot, because by default, if you only have the colon, the type that Godot will use here is the return type of this function. You see, when we write the arrow after a function, we tell Godot which type this function is going to return. And getNode returns the type node. But if you want to be more specific and get better autocompletion, you can tell Godot what is the exact type of the node that you are getting. In this case, color rect. So what I'm going to do then, pause overlay dot visible equals value. Okay, so next up, we want to pause the game, to use that pause variable. We're going to do that with input. So let's add a new pause input event. Go to project, project settings, input map, and let's create a new action called pause. Press enter to create it. I'm going to click the plus button here to add a new key, and we'll use escape to pause and unpause the game. Now, in our user interface script, around the top, we're going to add a new unhandled input function. It's one of the built-in callbacks that we've used for input, right? and we're going to check if the event or the input event parameter that we get corresponds to the action pause being pressed, in which case we will toggle the paused variable. So I told you that if you say just paused, it equals to, well, we can use not paused or the exclamation mark to negate the value. So it means if you have a boolean like that, if it's false, set it to true. If it's true, set it to false. In other words, toggle the value of my boolean variable here. I like to write using the not keyword because it's plain English, right? Paused becomes the opposite of the current state of the variable. Now, if I do that, it's going to change the variable directly because we're within that class and not go through the setter. There are two ways to go through the setter. The first one is to directly call the function inside the class. The other one is to use the self keyword, which is what we generally use at GDQuest. So self.paused will ensure that the variable goes through the setter function. This is because when you call the variable from another script, say from my retry button or whatever, you are implicitly going through that self. Godot is going to say, I want to change the pause variable of this instance of the user interface. So we're getting a bit more technical, but what we have to understand there is that in many programming languages, you have to explicitly write that self dot or this dot in your classes to refer to a variable that you created inside that class. And in GDScript, it's not the case. Most of the time, it is implicit. But in this one case, we need to make it explicit for Godot to go through the setter here. Finally, whenever you go through that unhandled input function, we don't want anything else to intercept that event if we already paused the game. So one thing you can do here is on the scene tree, call the set input as handled function. Whenever you press a key on the keyboard, all the nodes in the game that have unhandled input or a similar function will receive that event. And if you have two bits of your game, like your user interface and your player, that react to the same events, for example, pressing the arrow keys, you can use set input as handled to not propagate the event, right? So it will stop here. Only this function will process the pause input event.